Hi, everybody. This is the start of our second week. So we will have two mini lectures for our second week. This one, we will be looking at the human cell. So we're going to start talking about what that virus needs when it gets into a cell. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my lecture, and we'll start talking about this then. So in Module 2, we're learning about the human cell. Some of the learning objectives that I have set out for you guys during this week is that you should be able to define a cell. And when I say define a cell, that would also include identifying cellular structures of the human cells. So the assignment you have this week will have you drawing it with some of the structures that I want you to know. In addition, you will also need to know the function or functions of each of those structures. Some of the vocabulary that I would expect you're going to learn this week would be cell membrane, which will often be referred to also as the plasma membrane. We have the cytoplasm, nucleus, DNA, RNA, ribosome, proteins, and phospholipids. So with that, let's get started thinking about what a cell is. So the definition for a cell is that they are the basic unit of life, meaning that all organisms that are considered living are made up of one or more cells. There are single-celled organisms and multicellular organisms, but the common structure amongst all of these living organisms is that they're all made of a cell or multiple cells. I'm going to move towards our whiteboard because I'd like to kind of have you think about the different structures that we're going to talk about. So I often like to think about this as kind of a concept map. So if we have a cell, cells can actually be divided into two different kind of large groupings, and this will become more clear as the semester goes on for those of you that have not had biology or it's been a long time. But we can actually divide that into two categories. We have our prokaryotic cells, and these are ones that don't have nuclei, and we'll be discussing that in a minute. And this would include bacteria. So when we're talking about bacteria, they would kind of fall in this category. On the other side of this, we have a grouping that we call eukaryotes. And these then are organisms that their cells do have nuclei. So I'm going to put here no nucleus. And over here, I will put with nucleus. In addition, the eukaryotic cells tend to be bigger and more complex. Prokaryotic cells, generally speaking, the organisms are unicellular, only made up of one cell, and they're a little bit more simplified. But we can think about cells as having 5 characteristics, regardless of whether you fall on the prokaryotic side or the eukaryotic side. All cells have 5 components, and that would include DNA as the genetic material, and it's usually found in what is called a chromosome. That's just the structure that it's found as. We also have a cytoplasmic or plasma membrane. This is the barrier that surrounds the cell kind of from inside and outside. Third from this, we have what is called the cytoplasm. And I like to think of this as kind of a jelly that everything sits in inside of the cell, so it kind of fills the cell. We have something called a cytoskeleton. And this is basically the framework that runs through the cell of which things can be attached to or transported through. And then the last thing is something we have what are called ribosomes. And we have multiple of these in cells, and their whole job is to make proteins. I'm going to go through each of these, so don't worry if you didn't catch all of the functions. But what I want you to keep in mind is when I've talked about this, something that we have not talked about is what this class is on, and that is viruses. I'm putting them up here and kind of to the side with this little asterisk because viruses are not living organisms, and therefore they are not made up of cells. And what that really means is that those 5 characteristics that I put up over here, viruses do not have all 5 of these characteristics. So viruses are not cellular. Remember, we referred to them as acellular in the last chapter. So these are acellular. The other thing, sorry, a little bit of noise in the background. The other thing that we're going to talk about in a minute or later in the semester is something called prions, which would fall out here as well as acellular infectious agents. So anyway, this is kind of my concept map of thinking about where viruses fit in biology. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to bring us back to our lecture then and kind of walk through these. So as I said, there is your list of the 5 structures that are found in all cells. So even if we went to Mars and we were to find a new organism, if it had these 5 structures, we would be able to say it is cellular. From that, what I'd like to do is kind of show you, this looks a little bit complex, and obviously for the assignment this week, I'm not expecting you to go through every single one of these structures. But what this is showing you is a basic drawing of a cell, and in this case, we would think of this as probably similar to a human cell. The things that I want you to take note of is it's surrounded on the outside, which is the boundary between inside the cell and outside, by a cell membrane or plasma membrane, cytoplasmic membrane. I'm sorry, we use all these terms. They're all interchangeable. But here we see plasma membrane, and that's kind of this gold line around the outside. The other thing that I want you to think about is that we have the DNA. In this case, it's inside of a nucleus because this is an animal cell. It falls under eukaryotes and they have nuclei. So that's our second thing, is the DNA. The cytoplasm, as I said, is kind of this faint yellow in the background that I was saying is kind of like a jelly that everything sits in. And then I have the cytoskeleton, and up here, it's broken down into 3 different categories: microtubules, centrosome, and intermediate filaments. But you want to think about the cytoskeleton as running kind of throughout the cell as kind of this web or network of filaments or fibers that allow things to be anchored in the cell, but also moved. And then the last thing that we have is these little red dots that some of them you see are within the cytoplasm, just kind of free floating. And some of them are attached to this structure here. And these are our ribosomes. Our ribosomes, in this case then, ribosomes are what make proteins. And we talked about the fact that viruses need to make proteins in the first week. So hopefully this is a helpful kind of slide for you as you work on your assignment this week. But what I'd really like to do then is walk through each of these, kind of the important structures that I want you to know for this class. So the first is the cell membrane. Remember, I said it could be called the cytoplasmic or plasma membrane, but this is what is called a phospholipid. So it's kind of a fat and phosphate molecule that makes this bilayer. So if we think of outside the cell, this would be kind of outside the cell, and this would be inside. And this is what forms the boundary of the cell. And we refer to it as semi-permeable. That means that some things can get in and out, but others can't. And we often have kind of these protein tunnels that we might transport things through if they can't make it through the membrane. So those embedded proteins basically function, one is transporters, but you can see some of them have these little kind of tails sticking out, and they can work as receptors, often as receptors that bind to viruses and allow the virus to come in. We'll get to that in the next chapter. After the cell membrane, some of the other important components, the cytoplasm, as I said, is that gel-like substance that basically fills the cell and surrounds all of the organelles or different structures that make up the cell. The cytoskeleton is this network of protein filaments. I like to think of them almost as threads that are going through the cell. And their function is that they provide structure, really basically a skeleton to the cell, but they also allow different structures to be transported throughout the cell along the length of those threads, if you will. One that I didn't mention as one that all cells have, that's because not every cell has them, but it's important to us as we're learning, are structures called lysosomes. These play a big role when we think about the immune system. And these are basically, I like to think of them as sacks or bags of these very corrosive enzymes that can break things down. And so one of the big functions they have is they can break down molecules, whether that's something that the cell has consumed or if it's infected by, for example, a virus, this is what could aid the cell in actually breaking that virus down. Another one that we want to think about is the DNA, which I said are found in what we call chromosomes, kind of packages of DNA. And these are made of what we call nucleotides. So their building blocks are nucleotides. And they are found in the nucleus in human cells. So they kind of are protected from the rest of the cell within the nucleus. Their function is basically they're the instruction manual for the cell. They contain all of the information for that organism or cell to be that organism or cell or to function. And so that's a really important thing for the cell. It's what gives it its playbook, basically, to live its life. After the DNA, one of the last things that I really want you guys to learn is the ribosomes. And ribosomes are made up of both RNA, which we'll get to kind of as we move through this semester, and protein. And they are located, as I said, either free-floating in the cytoplasm, or they can also be attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And their function, regardless of their location, is to make proteins. It is their job to basically become protein factories, and they're going to be really important for viruses that will need to utilize the cell's ribosome to make their own proteins. That puts us in our checking in. Again, please pause here, write down the answers to these questions before turning back on the video to hear me go through them. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've turned that off and written down the answers. Remember, this is a great way to study for my exam because these tend to be questions that I expect you to know the answer to. So our first question in this is, what is the function of the cell membrane? The cell membrane works as a boundary, basically keeping what needs to be kept inside the cell inside and what it wants to keep outside of the cell. It is semi-permeable, so that means that some things can come in and out. The second question is, what cell structure can destroy infectious agents? Hopefully you wrote down lysosomes that have those hydrolytic enzymes. They play a role in immunity within our cells. The third question is, what is DNA made up of? And really, I'm looking for what are the building blocks? The answer for that would be nucleotides. And then the second question of that is, what is the function of DNA? And DNA is basically the holder of the instructions for this cell. They have all of the instructions for that cell to survive and perform the way that it needs to. The last question is, what is the function of ribosomes? That would be in the cytoplasm and connected to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, so attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Where are ribosomes located? Oh, sorry, I did the where are ribosomes located. What is the function of ribosomes? It is to synthesize or make proteins. Hopefully that was helpful. We'll go ahead and end here. If you have any questions, please do feel free to send me an email or put it up in our Ask a Question discussion board. Thanks.